Hi everyone, in this demonstration I will be painting China in oil, and this demonstration will focus on her head only and not the flowers and the rest of the body. The whole painting took over 8 hours to produce, so I need to shorten it just for the purposes of being able to upload it here and just to be able to narrate the whole thing. So we're going to stick to only the head. And I will have some speed painting in certain parts where it's repetitive, such as painting hairs. And where it matters, I'll slow it down to real time. So right now, I'm just going to block in the most important parts. And I'm using a mixture of burnt sienna and cobalt blue. And I mix my own black. I never use black out of the tube. The only time I'll use black out of the tube is if I am just using a little drop of it to mix with other colors or to intensify a color or to maybe gray out another color. But when I want to use black, I'll always mix my own. You get much nicer, richer black colors that way. So I'm just going to outline everything that needs to be outlined in dark paint. And this is just determining the placement for all my various patterns and shapes that I will have on her head. Whenever I mix my oil paints at this point, I always use a little bit of liquid, maybe about 20% liquid in my mixture. I don't recommend using liquid if you have chemical sensitivities or if you have any lung issues because it is very strong. You need a very well ventilated place. I'm asthmatic, but I still use it. Call me crazy, but I guess sacrificing my lungs for the sake of my art, I really need the speeding time, especially when I'm busy with commissions. I do not have time to wait for paint to dry and watch paint to dry literally. So I need something to help me speed up the drying time. So I use liquid. And I know there are other drying mediums out there. I have not tried them, so I cannot advise on them. So I'm just going to keep blocking in everything with my black mixture. Get my placement. Once it dries there, it's good, and I'm not going to lose anything. I just want to make sure I know where all my important parts are. When I transfer my drawings onto my canvas, I always try to all the lines that you see except for the outline, obviously, those are the darkest parts on my drawing and the darkest parts on the dog or whatever it is I'm painting. That's what I try and mark down onto my canvas, all those darkest parts as well as the outlines. I'm going to outline her little nose. China is a rescue. It's believed she's a Chihuahua. She might be a mix. The owners are not sure. She's super adorable. She just seems to be smiling. She's got such a happy look. Now to block in her nose, I mix a bit of cobalt blue and a little bit of white, as well as just a tad of burnt umber. I always try and grade down, create a grayish blue with a burnt umber thrown in there. And this is just to block in. And also by placing down this lighter mixture, like the light blue, it helps me know exactly where my highlights are going to go. So I usually put a mid-tone blue wherever I know lighter areas will be on a black part, such as a nose or anything black that I want to paint where I know there will be highlights. I first lay down or block in with a mid-tone blue. And then later on, when I go to highlight, I'm not fighting against black. And it just makes a nicer transition too. And now I've just got pure burnt umber mixed in with a bit of liquid, of course. And I'm just going to start blocking in those areas where her fur are more of an orange color. And even though I'm not really detailing any fur right now, I'm still trying to go in the direction of the hair. It just helps out the whole painting. If you could do that all the way through, just always follow the direction of the hair. It just makes everything so much easier. And then when you are going to go and paint in those fine lines with a very fine brush, your paintbrush is not going to be fighting against dried paint that's going in the opposite direction. And here I'm using burnt sienna, again mixed in with liquid. Just straight up burnt sienna, not mixed in with anything. And it's more of a transparent color too, so don't worry if you can see any canvas underneath. Burnt sienna is transparent. And now again, I'm using some of my black mixture, and it's cobalt blue mixed in with burnt umber. You can use ultramarine blue if you don't have cobalt blue. I like using cobalt blue because it's a very strong pigment, and it's also more of a transparent blue. Sorry, more opaque blue. The ultramarine blue is more transparent. And now for my whites, I just mixed in again some cobalt blue with some white. If it's too bright, you can gray it out by using just a little drop of burnt umber. And this way it's less of a bright blue, and just it'll still maintain a blue color, but it'll be just slightly grayed out. And everywhere where there will be white fur, I'm just going to block in with this light blue mixture. And the reason I use light blue is because once you paint the white fur on top, you can see definition and detail in the hair. If I just lay down solid white and then I try and paint bright white hairs on there, you're not going to see the white hairs. So in order to see white, you have to have something darker behind. And here I'm going just a little bit darker blue for her neck area. And the reason I'm going darker blue here is because I want her little chin to stand out when later on I'll make it just a little bit brighter and whiter. Her chin will stand out against her darker neck. And I'm just putting in little darker spots here with the grayish paint. Again, it's my black mixture, which is the cobalt blue and burnt umber, and I just added a little bit of white just to make it a nice dark gray. When you make your own black this way, it's a lot easier to manage your grays as well, whether you want warm grays or cooler grays. You just either add more blue to have a cooler gray or add more burnt umber to have a warmer gray. And then depending on what you're painting, you can also throw in some other colors in there if you want other different tints, depending on what you're painting. But it's a great mixture for your blacks as well as your grays, and it saves a lot of time and a lot of agony just by mixing your blacks and your grays this way. And again, just blocking in parts where there will be black fur, just blocking that in. And I apologize for being out of camera range. And when I paint with oils, I like to cover up my whole canvas with a whole underpainting, the blocking in, and it's a very ugly stage. It's really not appealing visually, but I like to get everything blocked in and mapped out, and then once that's on there and it's dry, I let it dry so it's dry to the touch, and then I can keep working on it. Once it's dry, then I can add more layers depending on what I'm painting. And then once I'm satisfied with all my layers, then I start detailing. So that's basically my process, is just block in, build layers, detail. It's a lot of work in between, but that's basically what it is. At this stage, it's important also that I don't make my initial layers too thick. I want to make sure my base layers or my blocking in is always a very thin layer, because you're painting with oils, so it's always important to follow the fat over lean rule. meaning your bottom layers need to be thinner than your top layers. If your top layers are thinner than the bottom layers, the top layers will crack when they dry. So we always want our fattiest and thickest layers to be the last ones. So I always start off with thin layers. For the pink of the ears, I used a combination of titanium white and I used a little bit of red. So you can just use either cadmium red light or cadmium red medium or even alizarin crimson. And I add just a little bit of burnt sienna in there just so it's not so pink and it kind of gives me a bit of a fleshy tone. It's the same thing with the tongue. And I had a little bit of black in there as well, and blue, just to make it a little bit shaded and grayish, but that will change later. And now inside the eyes, I'm starting to paint in a bit of the reflections, and for this I used cobalt blue and a little bit of burnt umber, just a little tad of burnt umber, just enough to gray it out, and some titanium white. So I just put that on there again very thinly, and just blocking in the tongue area as well. It's not going to stay that color. I'm just using a bit of cobalt blue and white in this area. And I grayed it out with my black mixture. So just a little drop in there. I didn't want any pure white in that area. And I'm applying some of that gray in this area as well. Even though I'm not detailing any hairs at this point, I still try again to go in the general direction of the hair if I can. But I'm really not concerned with any details at this point. It's just blocking in everything, figuring out where everything is going to go, and establishing my base colors that I will be working over top of and adding lighter colors as I work and detailing. I want to shadow around the nose as well, because once we're going to paint in the tiny little white hairs around the nose, they're going to be standing out against the darker undercolors. The general muzzle area is white, and she does have some darker spots, but even though it will be painted white, we don't want to have a white underpainting. If we have a white underpainting, again, white hairs are not going to show up. You're not going to have contrast. You're not going to have any visually interesting light or shadow. It'll be very flat and lifeless. So you always want to start off with a darker undertone when you're working with a white area. So either something bluish, brownish, purplish, depending on whatever you're working on. Just try and pay attention to the light and to your white area. Try and see what undertones you see in there. Is it a warm undertone? Is it cool? And just trust your instincts. I've said it before and I'll say it again, there's no magic formula. Study color theory, understand your colors, what warm tones are, what cool colors are. But other than that, you need to train your eye to see like an artist. You need to observe your subject and just contemplate it for a while and really look and see what colors do you have there. You can use computer tricks like saturating or color picking. Yes, you can do that. But train your eye. Try and train your eye to evaluate colors and see what colors are actually in a subject. And that comes with time, and the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. You'll get to a point you'll just naturally be out somewhere, let's say driving in your car, and you'll spot something and you'll be impressed by what kind of colors that you're seeing in something that somebody else might not notice. So now my first layer is dry, and I'm going to start adding more layers to my portrait. So I'm adding some more black to her mouth area, and that's again using my black mixture of blue with burnt umber. And so as I add another layer, the color saturation is intensifying, and this is what you want to see. And this is part of the whole point of building layers, is you're saturating your colors. you're making everything more intense, more vivid. You're not going to see through, and you're not going to see the canvas on the other side and have some transparent areas and more opaque areas. You just want to really saturate the canvas full of color and just intensify the color in those layers. And in the end, this will make your whole painting a lot more vibrant than only working with 1 or 2 layers of color. So it's still very much an ugly stage at this point because it's still blocking in, there's still no detail taking place. And when you're working small areas, work with smaller brushes. You don't want to mess up, especially delicate little areas such as the eyes, nose, and teeth. Kind of impossible to work with bigger brushes if you're trying to create detail and realism. If you're painting impressionism, then using larger brushes is perfectly fine. I do use larger brushes in larger areas if I'm blocking in larger areas. I'll often use brushes that are way bigger than what is necessary, but I find it's a good way of learning to control what goes onto the canvas. And of course, naturally, you're covering larger areas, so it saves time. I'm just going to keep detailing that eye, making sure I get the shape right. And the brush that I'm working with at this point is a Winsor & Newton #1 round brush, Cotman brush. So I like it for smaller areas. And a brush that I like even more than this one, and it was fairly inexpensive. I got it last summer or last fall. I don't remember which, but I've mentioned this before because I've been doing a lot of pet portraits in oils especially. I go through a lot of brushes, usually a liner or a filbert that I use mostly for painting my hairs. They will last me maybe 3 paintings, 4 paintings, because the weave in a canvas tends to wear down brushes, as well as just the amount of times and frequency that I use it. I use them so much that they wear out really fast. And this brush here is a 00 Sable Mix Script by Conwasa, and is such a beautiful brush. It's not the one I'm using right now, but it's another brush that I love to use for very fine details, and it's just an amazing brush. Another one that I like using is a #2 Escoda brush. It's a Kolinsky, and it's for watercolor, but I will use it only if I'm working on a panel. I would not use it on a canvas because anytime you're working against something rough, it's going to wear down fine hairs, and these are natural hairs. So my Kolinsky, I only save it for working on a smooth panel like a Richardson panel. This way it lasts a lot longer. I paid almost $30 for that brush, so I will not use it on canvas. And I've got just a little mixture of Van Dyke brown and white here, trying to find the right balance, just the right tone of brown. And I'm just very carefully outlining my eye. It's a little bit lighter inside the eye and a little darker around the rim. The lines are kind of hard right now, but we're going to try and fix that later. Right now I'm still just blocking in. It's still not really the detailing stage yet. And I don't rush through fine details like these. I just take my time and go slow. Sometimes I could spend several hours just on small parts like a nose or eyes. Especially the eyes, because I want to make sure I get them just right. If you can get the eyes just right, then the person, your client, will look at their portrait and know that it's their animal. So it's the most important part. I will refuse pet portrait requests if I can't see the eyes. I have accepted some that have used a flash. If I could still make out the basic shape of the eye, because then I understand a dog's eye anatomy. So, yes, I can figure out the eye, even if a flash was used, so long as I can see enough of the eye and the shape, and if I can manipulate it with Photoshop and kind of get the color right. But if I get closed eyes or something like that and they just want me to paint their dog, it's not going to happen because I don't know what their eyes look like. And you can try and look up the same breed of dog on the internet and paint those eyes, but that's not their dog. That's just some random dog on the internet and is their eyes. So, and I do not recommend just grabbing any picture off the internet to paint anyways, because photographs are copyrighted. But it's just to say that it's very important to have a good, clear photo of an animal's eyes if you want to do pet portraits. And I'm not afraid of turning down requests anymore. It's better to turn down something that is going to cause you grief, because you're going to struggle through it and it's not going to be your best work, and then it's going to reflect on you as an artist. So sometimes it's better to just turn down work. Using titanium white, I put tiny little white specks where the blue sky is being reflected on the top part of her eye, as well as on the bottom. Her eyes are really wet, so under the hot Texas sun, she's reflecting back some pure white light. I will adjust those later, but I wanted them in there just to help me know if I was on the right track with her eyes. So it just helped me figure things out at this point, but I will tone those down later on the bottom. Now I'm just going to start working some of the detail around the eye, some of the shading and colors. Just extending out some of the darker colors. And then once we paint lighter colored hairs over top of those, they'll really stand out. And again, I'm just working with thin layers. I do not want to use thick paint at this point. Thicker paint will also make it harder to work over top of if you're trying to apply small details later on. So keep it thin. If you're not working with liquid, you could thin it either with just your mineral spirits or turpentine or linseed oil. I also use linseed oil. I save it for my final layers, and especially when I'm painting or detailing the fine hairs. I'll mix it in with my liquid. And I'm just using some dark brown here, some burnt umber, where there will be a transition between the black to the reddish parts of her fur. There will be some darker brown as that transition is made. I almost said transmission. Now I'm going to start lightening it up a little bit, just adding another thin layer. And I have some raw umber. I'm going to start adding another layer to my nose now. And I'm working with cobalt blue and my black mixture again, which is cobalt blue and burnt umber. Again, if you don't have cobalt blue, go ahead and use ultramarine blue. It's fine. You just might get a bit more of a transparent black than a more opaque black that you would have with the cobalt blue. This is why I love to use the cobalt blue. It's more opaque. It's more expensive, but it's beautiful pigment. The pigment does affect the cost of paints. When they cost more, you usually have a better quality pigment or more of a rare pigment. Just outlining the shape of her nose, There is light being reflected back on there, so it doesn't look as dark as it is because of the light, but it is black. It is darker on the very top of her nose as well as the side, so I want to get that down. And this will also serve to make the reflections next to it, or the lighter areas, pop out more and be more bright. This is helping with your values. So you've got the light shining down on her nose where the blue section is, and further back it's darker where the light is not being reflected. So because you have that dark, it's helping our brains to understand that light is being reflected in those lighter areas. And this is why values are so important. They don't only add interest, visual appeal to a painting, they also help us understand parts and shapes. Light, they help define light. Like the saying goes, you can't have light without dark. So kind of like that principle. I'm using more cobalt blue here, just a little bit more blue than the rest of my mixture. And this is helping have a nice transition again from the black to the lighter blue areas. Still a funny looking nose at this point. It's not quite finished. So we're going to keep working it. And now I'm taking a dry brush. It's very dry. It's an old liner brush that's all beat up and useless now. It can't be used for anything, but they're perfect for fluffing up and blending. So I want to be sure this brush is absolutely 100% dry, and I just very gently touch the canvas, just tickling the canvas. And what this is doing is blending the paint as well as picking up paint. So I wipe the excess paint on a paper towel, but I want to make sure that brush is dry. And now I'm using my Winsor & Newton brush again, just adjusting those nostrils. Nostrils can be very tricky. They can feel strange at times. Just try and get down the shapes and the patterns and the colors, same as anything else. And keep adjusting till you get it just right. Again, a bit of a darker blue here. I want to make sure you also feel the roundness in her nose. And very little paint. If you put too much paint on your brush when you're trying to work small areas or fine detail, you're just going to create big blobs on your canvas, and then it's very hard to work with a lot of paint. So work very thin, and to do this, put very little paint on your brush. If you have too much paint, wipe it off on a paper towel. Make sure you wipe off the excess. You don't want too much paint on your canvas. And I'm going to start painting in those tiny little reflections. It's light being reflected on her moist nose. So it's my blue mixture, but I added white just to lighten it up. It's not pure white. And again, I just used a very dry brush just to mop up the excess paint and soften it. I'm going to make tiny little dabs, tiny little marks, just to suggest some highlights. And I don't want to go over the whole nose with this. I'm just going to take this white mixture, which is really light blue, and just go and select areas. You don't want to do too much, then it's overkill. Less is more. And I'm just going to smooth that out again, as well as pick up excess paint. Just very gently dabbing. You create nice soft effects that way. pale blue mixture here. We're going to lighten up that area under her eye. And here I'm still working with that light blue mixture. Just going to start lightening up where there are bits of white hair, brighter hairs. And I'm following the direction of the hair, which kind of curls or curves around her eye. And again here, just lightening up some hairs, following the direction of the hair. The paint is still wet. The darker paint that we put earlier, that we applied earlier, is still wet, so I'm kind of blending that in there. Just very gently, being careful not to have too much paint. So now I'm just going to start laying down some of the background color. I'm speeding this up because it's just straight up applying color. I mixed some white with a touch of black as well as some Van Dyke brown. And I just mix that together just to create a warm gray. And I'm just going around everywhere on the canvas. I want to make sure that everything is covered. I do not want to see any of the underpaint showing through my background color. I see this a lot, and it tends to be a common mistake with beginners, as they're not going to completely cover the canvas, and when you look at it, you could see little specks, little holes everywhere on their paint where you could see the undercolor. And if they don't tone their canvas, you're going to see a lot of white shining through. And I notice this especially with acrylic paint. It's so easy to do this with acrylic paint. So just make sure everything is covered. If you've never seen any of my other oil painting videos, before I ever even apply oil paint onto a canvas, I tone it. So by toning, what I do is I take a color like burnt umber, or you can use a gray mixture with Payne's gray and white, or any other mixture depending what you're going to be painting, and I just apply a little bit of paint on the canvas. Then I take odorless mineral spirits or turpentine, and I just wash my canvas completely with this. Leave it on for a couple of minutes, like it has to be a very wet mixture, and then I just wipe the whole thing off, leaving my canvas lightly stained. Then I let that dry, and then I'm able to work over top. So I'm still working that background. Now I'm just touching up my black paint and adding another layer of the black paint. And I'm trying to adjust my shape now that I've painted the background. So I have more blue in my black mixture this time. I have less brown and more blue. If you want a warmer black, you would put more brown or maybe even some red. If you want a cooler black, use more blue. And I'm going down on that side of China's head, extending the black down there. And again, applying another layer of black on that side. So see how by adding layers, your color becomes more rich, you have more value, and you have more depth. And this is another common mistake that beginners make, is by not using layers. They're just painting with one thin layer and doing everything on that first layer, and you could see through their paint, and you see splotches and uneven brush marks, and most of the time you don't see a range of values. So the paintings end up looking very flat and lifeless. So by working in several layers, you just bring your pigments to life. They look so much richer and you have so much more intensity in your colors. I'm going to start adjusting the color on the top of the head also. And I've got just burnt umber, straight up burnt umber mixed with liquid. And some black here, just extending that down, fixing my layers and making sure I have nice rich color on my canvas. I'm not very worried at this point about detailing hairs. Again, it's just layering. And here is some burnt umber again, just darkening some of the areas. And once everything's on, we'll be able to layer some hairs. Adjusting my values. And now using a filbert brush, I've got raw sienna. And I'm just going to apply some of that, adding a second layer on those reddish areas. So the raw sienna is helping to make it a little bit more opaque. And by mixing in the burnt sienna, we're keeping our reddish tone. And it's still not detailing at this point. It's still just the blocking in, just a second layer of blocking in. And I want to start lightening it up in the cheek area without going too light, but I just want to start producing some of the sunlight shining down on her fur. So I've got a little bit more of the raw sienna mixed in. And again, this is just a filbert brush, and I'm using the filbert on the side, and this makes little lines that start mimicking hair. So for my initial layers of fur, I always use a filbert following the direction of the hair, and this produces little lines on the canvas that start looking like hair. And then for my final layers, I'll go over top of those with a fine liner brush and produce tiny little hairs over top of that. So you're always having lines being painted in the direction of the fur. I always use filberts to start painting my initial hair layers. Not the blocking in, but the actual shaping and coloring of the hair. And it's a lot faster to work with the filbert too, rather than just having a tiny little brush for every layer. It could take countless hours. Oil painting is a long enough process already. This painting took an excess of 8 hours to make, and that's not in one sitting because every layer has to dry before you can apply the next. So it's very time consuming. And it's for this reason I have to condense this video also and have some areas that are speeded up. I slow it down where it counts, but I cannot narrate a video that's almost 9 hours long. It would just be a little impossible. And again, just following the direction of the hair. And it's hard to see because of the light reflecting down on the canvas, but when you're looking at it in person, you could start seeing hair being defined. I zoomed it in just a little bit closer so you can see a little bit more. If I zoom it in any closer, it's going to get blurry. So this is about as much as I can zoom in. And just overlapping those colors. And sometimes working into a wet paint can be to your advantage because you're able to blend areas together and have smooth transitions. And that's the beauty of oil paints, is the ability to blend colors together and just have beautiful soft effects. And looking at an oil paint in person is always so interesting to see how much richer the colors are, how luminous oil paintings are compared to any other medium. There really is no other medium that compares. I love pastels, and pastels really have beautiful, bright and bold, intense colors, and they are nearly pure pigment. But the light that is reflected back through an oil painting, the luminosity, nothing equals that. And that's not translated in photos when you look at photos online. You have to see oil paintings in person. What I'm using now is a very old craft brush. It's a fluffy brush. It's very soft, and I make sure it's clean and dry. And I'm just going over my wet paint, and with, again, very gentle pressure, I just kind of blend those paints together just to smooth everything out and blend the seams so I have no obvious color seams. One color transitions into the next, and it just makes everything look so much softer. And it also helps to level off your paint if you have thicker streaks, which will help you later on when you're trying to paint fine little hairs. And another thing that this brush helps you with is when you're blending one color into the next, it also kind of makes little fine lines which start hinting at little hairs blending into the next color, if you understand what I mean. So use that brush to your advantage, and I also use it to smooth out my edges into my background. I don't want rough edges. I like a nice smooth outline. It just makes everything so much prettier to look at than hard lines. I'm just going to soften everything this way, just going around, just gently tapping and smoothing. If I get a buildup, you see how I pull away my brush? I'm wiping off paint. I don't want paint buildup on my brush, so I make sure I keep wiping it. If it gets too wet, I'll take out another brush and go with another brush. It can get to the point where there's just too much paint being loaded or transferred onto the brush. So I'll speed that up just a little bit now that you understand what it is that I'm doing in this area. And I also extend out into the background, and this is really creating nice soft lines and just a really nice dreamy effect. I think that's why I'm so attracted to pastels and oils, is the ability to be able to do this. It's very hard to soften acrylics this way. And I'm just softening that side as well as lightening up my background a little bit. I just added a little bit of white in my background. And now that that has been completely smoothed out, it has dried, and now I can apply another layer. Sometimes I have 7 to 8 layers in a painting. So I keep applying layers until it's good enough for me to start adding details. It has to reach a certain point. And how do I know it's at that certain point. If I can look at it and it looks nice enough without all the little hairs painted in, then I know I have enough layers. And then those finer details are just gravy. So I just forever adjust those colors and those layers until I have enough depth. I see depth in my painting. I see light areas. I see values. I want all those colors that are underneath to show through the hairs that I will apply. And again, I'm just using my filbert brush here. So the hairs that are painted in are not as refined as if you would use a very fine brush, but you're still seeing a hint of hairs because the filbert brush is making fine lines, fine enough lines as you're painting along. And when I have a color on my brush, I like to look at everywhere on my canvas where it's required, and I will go to each of those areas where I feel that particular color is needed. This way I'm not wasting paint. I know some people like to paint and they start, let's say, from that left ear, and that whole ear will be perfectly finished before they move on to the next section. That's not how I paint. My method is more closely resembles the style of the old Dutch masters, working in several layers. I don't do grisailles. I will glaze when necessary. I know a lot of people like grisailles when they paint with oils. It's not my style. I would much prefer just working with several layers, many of those layers being opaque. Grisaille is when you have a tonal painting where you paint everything in one color, let's say either in black or gray or burnt umber, and that's why they call it grisaille. Gris is French for gray. So it was basically a grayed out painting where everything is painted in tonally with, like I said, either using a gray or a brown, and then all the values properly placed. And then once that's done, then they would add transparent layers of color over that gray painting, and those transparent colors would make the painting come to life. So it's a very interesting technique, but that's not the technique I use when I paint. I like to use a lot of opaque layers. And again, I'm just going to use my filbert and start painting the hairs. And I'm going to speed this up just a little bit now. And I'm just using some raw umber here on this lighter area of her cheeks. Raw umber is a pretty opaque paint, meaning it's not transparent, so it really covers well. And I'm using some burnt umber here, adding some brownish tones. And it's just basically the same process I did on top of the head. I've got my paint, I've got my filbert, and I'm just making small lines. And so I'm just going to go over her cheeks with the brown paint on my brush, using my brush sideways. It's nice and flat and sideways, and I just go in the direction of the hairs, and it makes very small lines on my canvas, which are starting to mimic fine hair. It's a little bit hard to see on the video. I'm just going to go over it everywhere that needs more of a darker brown tone. And I'm going to keep going around her little head and just seeing where I need to add darker brown. If you make a mistake, don't be afraid to use a paper towel, wipe it off with your finger. And I'm just applying darker brown here. And again, using the side of my filbert, it's helping to create the shape of hairs. And I'm lightening up my color a little bit. I added a little bit of raw umber to my mixture and a little wee bit of orange, cadmium orange, just a tiny little drop just to make it a little bit more warm. And some brown, and still just doing the same thing, just applying color, adjusting my layers, building up that range of values. And I'm adding brown here. I'm extending brown in straight lines following the pattern of the hair again using the filbert brush, and it's already starting to create visual appeal just because I'm having that transition between the blacks and the lighter areas by using this brown. It looks a lot richer, and we're starting to see a little bit of depth happening in the fur. And now I have again a black mixture. It has more blue in there than brown. And again, I'm just adding another layer, making sure it's black enough so that I have good value range. And I'm going to start just working in some color in the tongue, building up that shadowed area. I'm just adding in a bit of dark blue here. So it's basically my black mixture, but there's more blue in it. And I'm just bringing that down into the ear so we don't have it so bright and pink. There are shadows inside the ear, so we want to make sure we get those shadows. I'm taking some of my pink mixture and I added just a little bit more white just to lighten it up. There are bright areas inside the ear where light is being reflected. So we want to accurately depict shadows as well as light inside the ear. I'm just softening everything, blending everything together, making it nice and smooth. And this is helping to blend my shadows, and I'm getting a value range inside the ear as well. Because we're painting wet into wet here at this stage, we're able to blend these two colors quite easily and create gradual transitions. And I'm always using light pressure. The only time I basically use heavy pressure is if I'm scumbling something like a background or making grass or something. If I'm painting the background, I'll apply a lot of pressure to make sure that paint gets in there deep inside the ridges of the canvas, the weave of the canvas. But when I'm actually working on a painting and detailing and applying layers, I'm usually always using very light pressure. And again, I'm adjusting my blacks as well as the shape of my ear. You can see how as I apply each layer, the color keeps getting richer and deeper. And this is what we want. Just very carefully going around the edge of the ear. I've got my filbert brush sideways, and this is helping me create fine little lines, and I'm extending them past the ear just to hint tiny little hairs that are going past the ear line. I'm going to go back and double check all the areas that I feel need a little bit more pop of black, just that really deep, rich hue. That, of course, I will cover up with lighter colored hairs, but I really want that deep layer under there before I start detailing fine hairs over top. And I'm just going to speed this up a little bit now. And again, just going over all the areas that need another layer of dark color. And smoothing it out again with a clean, dry brush. And adjusting the shadow again. Now that I've smoothed out inside the ears, you could start getting a feel of shadows in there. And now I'm just going to add some little pops of brighter color inside, just to hint at highlights being reflected inside her ears. So it's my pink mixture again, and I just added a little bit of white. When I mix paint, I try and keep some aside without putting liquid in it, because if I put liquid in it, it will dry up. So I just use what I need. I mix paint and I take what I need, mix liquid in it, and always try and keep some aside so I can use it later on in the painting this way by adding white to it or whatever color I need. At least I have that original mixture. And if I have leftover paint when I'm done painting a painting session, I cover it up and I stick it in the freezer. This way my paint does not dry up and it's good the next day. You can keep it in the freezer for long periods of time. I'm not sure, but I've had paint in the freezer for weeks, even a month before I went back to it. It's a second freezer I have. It's not my freezer that I have in my kitchen, but a separate freezer. And yeah, it just keeps your paint nice and fresh. You take it out and it's ready to use immediately. So if you have leftover paint, just store it in the freezer if you're able to. If you have the one freezer, just make sure to warn people so they don't grab it and get oil paint all over your house. Just dab that down, light pressure. It just helps to soften everything and blend at the same time. Just by using very light pressure, just tickle the canvas. You'll hear me say that a lot when I'm oil painting, is just tickle the canvas. Very light pressure. Heavy pressure and too much paint can just create messes on your canvas. So practice very light pressure. Pressure is an important thing when painting, and it's something that too many instructors don't talk about. They don't mention the amount of pressure you should be using, and it's very important. And here I've added even more white in my paint, and you can really start getting the feel of light being reflected inside her ear now. It almost feels like a waxy ear. This also is helping to shape the gentle curves inside the ear. The ear is not just smooth and flat inside, there are bumps and ridges, and those are the areas that are picking up light. I'm going to do the same on this side, just adding light to those little bumpy areas inside her ear, and it's helping to give shape and definition. It's starting to look more like an ear now. And you've got the whole value range. You've got your bright brights depicting light, and you've got your darker areas, and these are for your shadows. And again, with my clean, dry, fluffy mop brush, I'm just gently tapping, picking up excess paint, wiping it off on a paper towel. And I'm just going to keep working those details inside the ears. And I've added even more white to my mixture here. It's not pure white, it's still that pinkish mixture that I originally started using, but I add more and more white to get it down to a lighter color. And again, I'm just going to mop that up. And now I've got my canvas flipped upside down, and I flip it upside down because it's a lot easier to paint tiny little hairs like this, pulling them towards me rather than having my arm awkwardly angled and trying to paint away. So whatever it is that you're comfortable with, do that. For me, it's often easier to just turn my canvas around and paint upside down and sideways when I'm painting small details like this. And I also had my camera set up, so I was kind of limited as to how far I could twist and turn my arm and angle it to try and get those hairs in. So it's much easier for me to just flip it upside down this way. And I'm just using a fine liner brush. And again, I mixed in some liquid fine detail. And now for this here, the liner brush I'm using is my 00 Konoha brush, the Sable Mix Script. So use any very fine liner brush that you might have. It's not necessary to use the equipment I have. You need to find your own tools that you will be comfortable working with. Every artist is different. Every artist has their preferences. So it's just finding what you like. And because I kind of had a rough line there, I just used a dry brush and got rid of it. So again, just very gentle pressure, and I'm just extending past the ear line, just painting out tiny little hairs, tiny little lines. I don't want them too thick, so you want to find the right balance of having enough paint on your brush. You want your paint to be well loaded without having too much paint, so that the minute you put the slightest amount of pressure, you end up with a blob. If you do get a blob, just wipe it off with a paper towel or with your finger. And again, for me, very important for me to have liquid fine detail. It just helps those little hairs flow a lot more nicely, especially when you're fighting the weave of a canvas. I prefer personally, if I could tell every client that their oil painting will be on a smooth panel, that's what I would prefer to paint on. I have to admit, I highly dislike painting very fine lines on a canvas like this. And this here's a fine weave canvas. This is a portrait canvas. You could apply gesso over on top to try and get rid of the weave as much as possible, but it will still always be there. And if you're going to be covering up the canvas with so much gesso that 20 years from now it's all going to crack off, because canvas moves, it shrinks, it expands under different humidity conditions. If you're going to be doing that, you might as well just be going right straight to a panel. So I prefer using a panel, and I don't receive endorsements, but I do prefer the Richardson smooth panels. I don't cover them up with gesso. I just tone them and I'm ready to paint. And because they're very smooth, your fine brushes are not fighting against the weave in a cloth, cotton or linen, such as you would in canvas. When you're painting on a smooth panel, it's so easy to get nice smooth lines and very fine lines. So personally, I would paint every single animal painting or pet portrait on a panel. But people don't understand when they're not artists, they don't understand, and they prefer canvas because traditionally oil paintings are painted on canvas and people think that's how it should be done. It should be on a canvas. But as a professional artist who's been doing this for many years now and experience, trust me, panels are better and they're sturdier than canvas. You can knock on a panel, you could drop your painting and it'll be fine. If you don't take care of a canvas, many things can happen. Like I said, they shrink and they expand under different humidity conditions. And living in northern Canada, I experience this quite routinely. It's very dry in the winter, so they shrink, and it's very hot and humid in the summer. We can get to 100 degrees very easily up here, and it's very humid because of the Great Lakes, and then it expands. So this has an action on the paint that's sitting on top of the canvas. Humidity can also have a negative effect on canvas. If an area is very humid all the time, eventually over time it could cause a canvas to rot from underneath, from the canvas, the cloth underneath being damp all the time. It could get moldy, and then that compromises your painting as well. It doesn't happen all the time, it's a risk. It doesn't mean that if you live in a humid area your canvases are going to rot. No, it's a chance. This is another reason why I do not recommend to ever frame an oil painting or an acrylic painting. Anything that's painted on canvas should never, ever, ever be covered under glass. That glass will prevent air from moving and you could compromise your painting and it could create the canvas to rot. So always have your oil paintings and acrylic paintings under traditional canvas with no glass over top. And now I've got China flipped over on her side and I'm going to start detailing some fine hairs. And again, I've got liquid fine detail mixed in here as well as linseed oil, and it just helps the flow of the paint. And I use light pressure, but a fair amount of pressure because I do want to get that paint down there on the canvas. I do still have that weave that I need to fight. So I want to make sure I get that perfect balance of just enough paint on the brush, but not too much that I'll just create splotches. And I'm going in with my darker colors first. I want to make sure I get most of my darks down. I will adjust some darks if I need to later on. But before I start layering light, I want to make sure all my darks are down. And whatever little hairs that I need to apply are down there. So I'm just going to work around her ears. And this is a 00 brush that I'm using. Just very light pressure. I just want to make sure I get tiny little hairs. They're just fine wispy hairs. And you want to make sure you have them curving as well. They're curving upwards in the photo, so I want to make sure I get that down. And some will overlap each other. See, if this was being painted on a panel right now, you see how it looks like I'm struggling with the brush against the canvas? It's hard to get paint down, to get fine hairs on the canvas. If this was a panel, it'd be very easy to get those little fine hairs on there. So just understand when you're working with canvas, you do have those limitations that you have to work around and just try and figure out how to best go about it. So this is why I need the liquid fine detail as well as the linseed oil just to help my paint flow. So we're gonna start doing the same thing on the other side. Just work those fine little hairs. I've speeded this up just to twice the speed. If I don't like the line I created, I can either wipe it off or sometimes I can just smooth it out and make it finer by taking a dry brush, a dry clean brush, a fluffy brush, and just lightly going over it. If you mess it up, just wipe it off and make another little fine line with your brush. And now I'm going to start doing the same thing but using lighter color. I'm going to start building up my lights in this area. And I'm just using no, not burnt, raw sienna, sorry. Just using a mixture of raw sienna here. Just trying to get in some of that lighter color. Start defining some hair, detailing. And I'm extending those little hairs into the black paint. Keep in mind that the whole black area is pretty much dry at this point, except for the little fine hairs that I have extending into the background. The rest of the black paint is dry. If it was not dry, I'd just be creating mud. So this is why you want your layers to be dry in between. If they're not, you're not going to be able to paint those little fine hairs. And smoothing it out with a clean dry brush. It helps to keep everything soft. And we're just going to keep going over everywhere where I feel this shade is needed. Like I said earlier, when I'm working in a certain color, I like to go everywhere with that color, everywhere I feel it's needed, before I move on to another color. It just simplifies things this way and you waste a lot less paint. Especially because I use liquid. Whatever I've already mixed with the liquid will dry. I can't leave it until the next day unless I stick it in the freezer. So if I just have a little bit left on my palette and I can use it up, I'll use it up where I can. Now I'm starting to paint in lighter colored hairs over that little dark section on her cheek. So it's a brownish mixture using burnt, burnt umber and raw umber. It's so easy to confuse the two. greatly different colors. One is light, one is dark, and I always get confused between the two names. So I'm following the direction of the hair too when I'm applying these. And now I'm going to some lighter hairs, the little whiter hairs underneath the eye. I'm just zooming in a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to go in a gentle curving motion, reproducing the direction the hair is growing in. And this is where that tiny 00 liner brush is so valuable. You just could not do this with a larger brush. And again, always using just a little amount of paint. I'd rather have very little paint on my brush and reload it frequently rather than having a lot of paint on my brush and just creating big blobs every time my brush hits the canvas. And they're just tiny little marks there just to highlight the lower lid. And here I have blue, a bluer mixture using the cobalt blue and white and burnt umber. And I'm just putting it where it's needed, where there's a transition between lights and darks. And again, just adjusting that eye with some black. I don't want to lose my shape. I want to make sure that her eyes remain the way they are on the reference photo. I'm still adjusting the inside of the eye, the dark where the pupil is. So there's the top half that has the blue reflection from the sky, as well the bright reflection from the sun, and then it's black right underneath that, and then you could see the brown of her eyes. And now we're going to flip this back on the right side and just start working those teeth a little bit. And for the teeth, I don't want to use straight white because teeth are never pure white. I use just a little bit of white mixed with Naples yellow, and just a tad of the Naples yellow, depending on the teeth that I'm working on. If the animal has really yellowish teeth, then I follow what I'm seeing and I'll add more yellow or more brown accordingly. So just pay close attention to whatever animal you're painting and whatever color their teeth are. And you want to make sure you get all those different variations of color in there. Some are more brown, some are more yellow. So you'll just have to use your judgment. But in her case, her teeth are pretty white, but because they're white, I'm still not painting them white. It's more of a slight Naples yellow. So they look white here because of the camera. It just tends to flash white, and light colors, it makes them appear as white. But I'm not painting them straight white. I'm just going to fix that shape. I went up just a little bit too high there, and that's okay. I'll use some black after just to clean that up some more. If I try to clean it up too much right now, I'm just going to push white paint everywhere. So here I am with the black. Just cover it up a bit. Try to fix that shape, get it just right. And see, I'm just making gray. So I still have to clean it up. And this is also where it's a good thing I didn't use too much paint. I'm going to start working on her chin and her neck. Her chin is wider because it's jutting out more than her neck, so it's going to pick up more light. So you need to make sure to paint that brighter than the fur behind. And on the fur behind, on my white, I had added a little bit of brown in there, as well as just a touch of yellow, just to try and make it a little bit warmer. It's picking up reflected light, so the yellow kind of hints at reflected light on her white fur. My client wanted China to have a little floral collar, and there was none in the reference photo. So what I did is I bought artificial flowers and I put together a nice little collar by myself and just took photos and tried to imagine natural sunlight in those flowers. I'm not going to do a lesson on the flowers. That alone would take a few hours, and some of the flowers are not even recognizable flowers. I couldn't even begin to explain how to do them. I just completely improvised it. She loved it, so that's all that counts to me. That's all that matters. But for this lesson, we'll just stick to the head. And there, and I'm still just blocking in extra color, just building those layers. Once those are dry, then I'll be able to start detailing. I'm just making sure I get the shadowed areas down properly. Her muzzle turns a little bit slightly inwards, going down towards her mouth. So the shadows help to suggest that. And this is just a gray mixture. Again, it's using cobalt blue, burnt umber, and white, but I have more brown in it this time, less blue. I'm now going to start detailing some of the hairs inside her ear, and I'm just using a light blue mixture, again with cobalt blue, burnt umber, and white. There's more blue in this mixture. And if you see the black, how it looks faded, it's not as deep looking as it was earlier. That's because it's dried, and that's okay. Once you varnish that, it's still going to become its original deep, rich black, the same as it looked when it was wet. So as long as you have enough layers of black on there, you should be good. And using a very fine liner brush, I'm going to start applying hairs on the other side too, as well as extending past that line, past the ear line, where the background and the ear meet. And this will help to build depth in the ear. Even though it's black fur, there are some highlights being reflected in that fur. And this is why we're painting lighter hairs in there. We don't want to just leave it black, otherwise it would look flat. There would be no life, no depth, no dimension, no texture. And again, always pay attention to your reference and pay attention to which direction that the hair is growing in. And inside the ear, sometimes you can have all kinds of hairs going crazy and going in different directions. So just try and pay attention to those little hairs. And I use very gentle pressure. And again, not too much paint on my brush. What I just did there is I was looking at my reference photo and using my brush and my eye as a guide to help me determine where to place the longer hairs that are jutting out from her ear. So the eye helps me to determine the location. And again, I'm just painting random hairs and the direction that they're growing in. It's a little bit hard to see because of the glare, but it's unavoidable with oil paints. I need to have a light so I could see what I'm painting, but the camera just picks up the light, and you get a lot of light bouncing on your canvas and a lot of glare. In order not have glare, I would have to keep the camera far away on an angle, and then you would not see the brush hit the canvas. It would just be a far away recording. So in order to have it up close like this, I unfortunately need the light and I need the camera up close, and it's picking up the glare. And I'm going to speed this up just a little bit while I finish painting in those hairs. And I'm going to keep applying them wherever they're needed. You never want to push down too hard on your brush. You will just make big splotches on your canvas. So this is why using very fine pressure is important. And now I'm just using some black and just extending some of those fine hairs up into the ear or over the ear. And I'm just going to adjust the hairs on top of her head as well as correct the shape and make sure that the shape is good. And just adjusting those brown hairs as well. So I used the burnt, burnt sienna. This is what I used for this. That's right, burnt sienna and raw sienna. And so it's more of a reddish brown. And now I lightened it by adding a little bit more raw sienna, and that lightened my golden mixture. And I'm just going to extend those little hairs into the black parts so that the brownish hairs overlap the dark. You just don't want to have a hard stop between your brownish color and your black. You want to see some little fine hairs being extended into the black. And the lighter mixture is helping to create reflected light as well in her fur. So just gentle little marks with my liner brush. And this is just a cheap brush here that I'm using. It's a 10-0 Zen from Royal and Langnickel. So it's just a very fine liner brush. I go through a lot of them. Sometimes I like to use the cheaper brushes. They do the job okay, and when they're finished, it's not painful when I have to toss them out. I've ruined many expensive brushes. So many that I'm afraid to try expensive brushes now. I've wasted so much money on brushes, and despite taking good care of them and cleaning them properly, I've ruined many. And another thing I've learned, if you're going to be painting a lot with oil, I used to routinely use a silicoil jar, and I know a lot of people use them. If you're going to use a silicoil jar, and that's those glass jars that have a little metallic spiral sitting on the bottom, and you fill it up with solvent and you rub your brushes in there to clean them, I find those silicoil brushes destroy natural hairs. So they're great for a really coarse hog bristle brush, for example, those are fine. You could clean those in there, no problem. You can clean synthetic brushes in there, no problem. But when it comes to natural hairs, I find it destroys them in no time. And it's only logical, right? You have a metal surface, like the coil, inside the jar, and that coil is really rough. It's not smooth. You could feel it pulling on the hairs every once in a while. So imagine taking your own hair and continually rubbing it on a metallic surface like that. What's going to happen? Your hair is going to split and it's going to break. Well, that's the same thing that's happening to natural fiber hairs, fine natural fibers such as a sable. So don't use any silicoil jar, anything with friction. Don't use that on your finer brushes, your natural hairs. Just stay away. Just swish them in a jar that's got solvent. Just gently swish it around, tap on the side, and rub off. Swish again if you need to. I also use safflower oil to rinse my brushes in. And for a final wash, I like to wash when I need to wash them with a soap. I don't use dish soap on the natural hair brushes because natural soaps are dish soaps are detergent and they strip hairs and they strip the hair of their natural oils. So what I like to use instead is Murphy oil soap because it's an oil-based soap. It's perfect for oil painting brushes and natural fibers, not natural fibers, but natural hairs. Just a little trick. I've been planning to make a video on cleaning brushes forever. I just don't have the time. Hopefully soon I can manage to find a few hours just to make that video. So many people want to know how to properly clean oil paint brushes. And here again, with my golden mixture, I'm just extending over top of the black, both on the ear and on her forehead. I'm going to start painting in some finer detailed hairs around her brow area. And again, very important here to follow the direction of the hair. It curves all the way around. You get a nice half circle around the eye on top as well as on the bottom. And these are shorter strokes here. They're not long strokes, so just be very careful to have short, tiny little strokes. And I keep looking at the reference photo, making sure that I know where I need to go with this color. So I've just lightened my color with the raw sienna. And again, I'm going to repeat this again. It's a very tedious process to paint in all these little hairs, especially because working in layers, it's not just that one layer. Once this layer is dry, then you have to go back over top of that layer and just keep highlighting again. So it's all those many layers that create depth and create realism. And I'm just going to speed this up just a little bit. You can still very easily see that I'm painting little hairs, and the hairs are small here. They're not long strokes again. Because it's her forehead, they're shorter hairs. And I'm extending those little hairs into the black so it'll look more natural. You don't want to have just that solid line, and I'm going to extend it into the black as well. I've got this just a little bit more brown. Because it's not pure black, it's kind of like black and brown fur mixed in some areas. So the easiest way to do that is to have a black underlayer and then paint in some brown hairs on top. That way some of the black shows up from underneath. Sometimes just dabbing a finger over a mark kind of helps to soften it, especially if you had just a little bit too much paint or it's a little too harsh. Just dab it down a bit, tap it down with your finger, and it just kind of helps to smooth it out. I'm painting some darker hairs again just to try and get more detail and definition. Just mixing it up with the dark hairs and the light hairs. When you're painting a multicolored dog like China, you have to understand how there are always various colors that are going to meet in certain points. So it's not always just one color in one area and then another solid color in an area. A lot of those colors will mix together in certain areas, so you will be going back and forth between various colors and lighter hairs, mixing up light hairs with dark hairs, brown hairs with white hairs, whichever. So you really need to look closely at your animal and determine what colors are in there, what do you see, and just paint them accordingly. You might have some white mixed into the brown. You might have some brown mixed into the white, brown mixed into the black. So just really pay attention to that. And again, I'm just detailing around the eye, extending little tiny hairs coming down from the inner corner of her eye. And those little tiny hairs are darker and they're going into the white as well as the brown. They're a little hard to see, but you still want to get them in there. I'm going to extend some of those darker hairs into the brown. I'm going to fix my shape around that white part. And she has darker hair there as well, so I want to make sure I get that in there so that I'm accurately representing her patterns, her individual patterns. And I had the canvas upside down here again, but I flipped it this way so that you could see the eyes and see what I'm doing. If I left it upside down, it'd just be a little trickier to see. And I'm just going to start on the other side now and start detailing that side of her face. So again, working with some of the darker hairs, painting those in. Still very much at the ugly stage at this point. We just don't have enough fine details layered in there yet. So I'm still going to consider this the ugly stage until those little hairs are all painted in and we have all our detail. And I have a more of a brownish color here, and I am going over the black and detailing. And here I have a lighter blue mixture, more of a gray. So again, it's a cobalt blue, the burnt umber, and white. And I don't have it too light at this point. It's still a darker bluish gray, and I'm just starting to detail some of that black fur. And this is how I detail it, is by having a blue mixture. And with each layer, I'm going to lighten that blue mixture. And this will produce light being reflected on the black fur. And I'm still using shorter strokes here. The hair is not really long. It is starting to get longer as we get down around the head, but it's still shorter hair, so I'm keeping my strokes short. So it's not only important to follow the direction of the hair, but try and pay attention to whether the hair is long and just adjust your strokes accordingly. And a goldish color here, again, raw umber. And I lightened it up with a little bit of white. And I added just a touch of cadmium yellow medium in this, just to start adding some of the sunlight in her fur. Just a touch, you don't want it too strong. So each layer should get lighter and lighter. And don't be afraid to have hair overlapping and crisscrossing, so long as you follow the general direction. And now just some tiny, tiny little lighter hairs around her brow. I slowed this down a bit just so you could see how small my strokes are. They're just very gentle strokes, light pressure. They overlap each other. I'm just tickling the canvas with my paint. If you push down too hard on your brush, what happens is your brush flattens up against the canvas, and that's why you don't get nice strokes. So don't push down on the brush, just let it gently fall on the canvas. I have brown paint here, so it's difficult to see up against the black, but I am having it overlap the black. We want to have a natural transition between all the colors. Now you're going to start seeing longer strokes as you get down to the side of her head. The strokes should become a little bit longer. You can use a longer liner brush as well if you're working on longer hairs. For example, if you used a number 2 liner brush or a script liner, that would be perfectly fine. You have to use even more gentle pressure if you're going to use a longer liner brush. Because they're longer, it's easier to have the very tip of the brush go flat on your canvas if you push too hard. So gentle pressure, just keep in mind pressure is very important. So I'm extending that brown now where I need it down in her cheek area. And just going everywhere on my canvas where I feel brown is needed. There's some in the ear as well. There were tiny little brown hairs sticking out in there. So I want to get those down. And her eye is picking up light here, so I want to make sure I get that on the eyelids. So just a gray mixture, that's more on the blue side. So I have more blue in my gray. Now we look like we have eyelids. And I'm applying a slightly lighter shade of gold on top. And this is starting to give us even more texture and definition in our hair. And again, I've got my black paint again, just painting in some little black hairs overlapping the brown. So you're continuously going back and forth between your various colors and making sure you're getting those overlapping colors. And this will make your dog fur look completely natural because it's not just solid colors. Now I'm going to start painting the hairs on the side of her head. So I've got her flipped over on her side again, and I've got my gray mixture using again the cobalt blue, the burnt umber, and some white. So it is cooler. It's more on the bluish side. And I'm just painting in some fine hairs all the way down the side and extending into the finer black hairs that we had painted earlier. On the little section I just painted, the hair kind of curves downwards and then upwards and downwards again. So it's very important to try and get that little pattern down accurately. Sometimes fur has those interesting little patterns and curvatures, and you just want to make sure you get those in. I'm just smoothing out with a completely dry and clean brush. And now I'm coming in with some golden colors again. Again, just a mixture of the raw sienna. Sometimes I add a little bit of orange in there, and sometimes I will add a little bit of medium cadmium yellow. And I'm just going down, just painting them where I need them, following the direction of the hair. The hairs are longer, so I'm using longer strokes. Now you can start to see how the highlights are taking shape. And it's adding more interest to her face. It's part of how we build light. I'm going to start detailing on her cheek as well. And just getting some little subtle hairs going down. And we still want to keep some of that dark color underneath so that we can make out the curvature of her face, the curvature of her cheek. And this helps to give shape to our face by understanding how to use the lights and the darks. It'll be brighter up on the top area of her cheeks because that's where the light is hitting. And as we get lower and it curves inwards, it gets darker. So again, this layer is lighter, and you always want to gradually lighten as you layer. It doesn't mean you have to apply that lighter mixture everywhere, just where it's needed, but wherever you need to add more light, you want to keep getting lighter and lighter. And these strokes are just smaller strokes because the hair is shorter and they get longer as you get further down the cheek and more towards the back of her head and down her neck. Then the hairs get longer. And now I've flipped her back and I'm going to keep adjusting around my eye and painting in some lighter, tiny little hairs just going down and curving around. And again, just using short, tiny little strokes. I know some people like to use rake brushes or the kind of brushes that have little grooves cut into the brushes. I don't like those because it makes the hairs all uniform, and we all know hairs and fur is not uniform. They overlap and intersect, so I don't like using those. I personally don't like them. I know a lot of artists do like using them. I personally don't. I'd rather just take the longer approach. And yes, it does require more patience. It is a very tedious process, but I like to take the longer way around doing it and just painting every hair individually. Now, on the other side, and again, just painting in some of that gold mixture, painting longer hairs because her hair is longer on the side of her head. I'm going to keep detailing and refining. There's still some short, tiny little hairs on that side of the face. And they're gradually getting longer as I go down. And I'm just going to speed this up just a little bit. It's the exact same process as on the other side and what we've already been doing. I'm just lightening up the layers as I go. As you get closer and closer to the eye, the hairs get smaller and smaller. And as you get right in those inner corners, they're even just tiny little dots. And now it's dry on top of my head, so I'm going to go back and just refine again. Just add in some more little hairs, more highlights. And when you're adding highlights like this, you want to make sure you closely look at your reference photo and just place them where they're needed. You don't need to go everywhere. Pay very close attention. You don't want to have overkill with your highlights. So now I'm going to come in with some lighter highlights. And so I've taken my orangey brown mixture and I've added a little bit more raw sienna as well as some yellow and a little bit more white just to lighten it up. Not too much, just a little bit. And I'm just going to do random hairs wherever they're needed. And you can start getting the feel of sunlight shining on her now. That yellow is what did the trick. And that was cadmium yellow medium. And you want to make sure you just have them naturally overlapping and extending over other colors. My strokes are getting shorter and shorter here. I'm just hinting little highlights at the tip of the hairs. Just tiny little hairs extending past. I want to make sure I get the proper curvature and that they go in the proper direction. And I just very gently use just the very tip of my brush. Once you get used to it, you can actually go quite fast. And the same thing here, just tiny little strokes following the direction of the hair. And again, this layer is lighter. You can really see the depth and definition taking place now. You actually see the texture in the fur. And now we're just going to repeat the same process on the cheek, and it's exactly what we did earlier except with just a lighter color. And this is just adding more highlight and more definition. And we're going to extend some of those lighter hairs over top of the dark areas we've previously painted, as well as down here on the side of her cheek where there is more sunlight being reflected. And because we're still keeping some of the dark area, it's giving our face a shape. You could see curving motions on her cheeks. It's not just a flat surface or a flat shape. We're seeing curvature everywhere on her face because we're building up lighter areas and keeping some other areas darker. It's giving the whole face shape. And again, overlapping some of the darker areas that we previously painted. Just bits of highlight, bits of sunlight everywhere. And it's the same mixture as before, but with a little bit more white and a little bit more yellow. Just a hint of yellow. Yellow is a very strong pigment. So when you're first starting to mix any paints with yellow, just use tiny little drops. Like, I mean, just a tiny little pinprick of a drop. Start there, mix. If it's not enough, then do that again. It's better to have very little as compared to having too much, and then you have too much yellow and it's too strong and it's overpowering. Yellow is a very strong pigment, so go easy. I have a bit of orange here. I mix some burnt sienna with a touch of orange. I'm just adding little orangey lines going into the black. It kind of looks like sunlight bouncing on brown fur, which is what it is. And lightening up that area too. I have more white here. I'm going to randomly place very light hairs wherever they're needed. It takes a lot longer to create an oil painting than a pastel painting because of the drying time for one. And then there's also time spent on mixing colors. That's very time consuming. And then even just while you're painting, you're continuously going back to your palette and loading up your brush with paint. So that's very time consuming. And then the actual application of the paint takes more time than working with, let's say, a pastel pencil, where you can just grab your pencil and quickly go all over your working surface. With a paintbrush, it's a lot more tricky to handle. You have to hold it a specific way, use specific pressure, specific motions. These things take time. So now I'm just using an angled flat brush. I'm just basically glazing, just adding a very thin coat of an orangey mix. It's just a bit of burnt sienna. burnt sienna mixed in with a little bit of raw umber. I'm just trying to get the tones right in certain areas. Just kind of little color corrections. Now I'm going to go back up on top with an even lighter blue and just start adding more highlights up on top. And you see how my brush is just barely touching the canvas. Just barely. I just want a very light touch. Just very gently suggesting hairs. I just want tiny, tiny little bits. These are just tiny reflections, light bouncing in just select areas. Not every hair has this brighter light. It's kind of like little sparkles on her fur. So this is why I'm just having tiny little marks, just randomly, just adding in those little sparkles. Just go very, very gently. Her fur's starting to look like it's shining now. So even though we're in the sunlight, because it's black fur, the light bouncing on it is still a cooler light. We're still working with blues. So to paint the light, the strong daylight on the black fur, we're working with blues. And to paint light on her brown areas, we're adding yellows and oranges. And this is how you're creating light on the fur. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit. I'm still just building up the light. Just tiny little strokes, dabbing here and there. I'm just fine tuning some of the finer hairs around her eyes, and I'm using white hair, just straight up white, thinned out with the liquid fine detail, as well as linseed oil. So I'm just giving it a little pop of light under her eyes where she's got white hairs. Just gentle little tiny strokes, overlapping everything. And you get a little bit longer as you go down. And a few more little hairs up on top. And you don't want to rush this. You want to go very slow because you want to make sure you don't get too much paint and that your strokes are just tiny little marks. Very carefully painting those lines in. And I'm going to speed this up here while I finish painting these lines. And that's all basically fur is just painting lines and just paying attention to colors and shapes, the length of those lines, as well as the thickness of those lines. And just lightening it up a little bit more on the top of her cheek area. Just little bits of light hitting. And with each layer that I'm applying, you still see the other layers underneath in certain areas. They still show through. That's why I don't paint with just a couple of colors. And as I state in all of my videos, if you want to capture realism, always paint an area with a minimum of 3 or more colors. Minimum 3. If you have less than 3, if you only use 2 colors in any given area, that section will look flat. It'll look lifeless. If you use a minimum of 3 colors, your areas will come to life and your work will look more realistic. So I'm just refining little bits. Just adding in those final details. We still have to work on her muzzle after and her mouth area. And now I'm going to go back to that side and just refine those little wispy hairs on the side of her face. Just make final adjustments there. And I'm just adding more highlights around her ears and temples. So again here, it's just lighter bits of sparkles hitting her black fur. I don't want it everywhere, just randomly. I was able to wipe that off with a paper towel because the layers underneath are dry. If the layers underneath were not dry, everything would end up wiping off. And more little bits of light. We also can't forget to paint in longer white hairs. So we do have white hairs sticking out from the side of her head, and we want to make sure we get those in, as well as on the other side we added some longer white hairs extending onto her black fur. And now we could start working on her muzzle and that white section that we haven't touched at all since the beginning of the video. So now I've got pure white paint and I'm going over. I know it looks really bright white and you really can't make out the little white hairs right now, but the layer underneath is more of a blue color, so in person you can see all those little white hairs. It's just the camera is making everything really bright. And here I was measuring up against the eye. Even though everything was previously sketched out on the canvas and is painted in now, sometimes in the process of painting, it's easy to go past your lines and to kind of extend your paint too far and ruin your shapes. So I just wanted to measure using my eye to make sure that the muzzle is not going too far or that it's going far enough. So I want to make sure the position is good before I continue. I don't want to waste all my time detailing that just to have to start over because I've messed up on the muzzle. I've made it too wide or not wide enough. So again, in this area, the little white hairs are overlapping on top of the black. So I'm just randomly putting those down. Just tiny little marks, just very gently. I'm not pushing hard at all on my brush. I'm just using the most gentle pressure I can exert. Wipe that off. I pushed down a little bit too hard, and that's what happens. You get too much paint. So the pressure is very important. And there are tiny little hairs sticking out from her muzzle here, also overlapping the black. See how it's a long process? This is why I have to speed up some parts because it would just be way too long to play the whole thing in real time. It's just not possible to do that. When I narrate a video, if I narrate a video, a 2-hour video that could take me 8 hours, 5 to 8 hours of narrating, I have to edit a lot and delete a lot, start over a lot, repeat a lot. So it's not just straightforward. I wish I could just talk as I'm painting. That would just simplify things so much more. But I can't. I have to leave my phone on. I have to be ready to answer calls for personal reasons. And I have my dog. She gets so impatient waiting in the studio. She's an older dog now. She's going to be 10. My studio is in the basement, so I don't have any natural daylight. I have one small window. It doesn't give off much natural daylight, so she gets tired of being in the studio. And so I paint for a little bit and she starts bugging me and the phone's ringing or the doorbell's going off. There's a delivery. So it would just be impossible for me to record and talk as I'm recording. So I have to record bits, stop and edit. And then I just have to do the voiceovers once everything is finished. So it takes a lot of time. And now I'm just working that area, just painting tiny little hairs, extending those on top of the black as well. So I've zoomed in a little bit closer so you can see the tiny little marks I'm making. And I've just got more of a gray mixture here. I don't want the pure white. And just making very fine lines. I'm going to keep working the detail on this side. I'm going to start cleaning up the nose. Just fixing up my dark areas again. Just make sure I get everything right, as well as that tiny little line that runs through the center of the nose. And I'm adjusting my nostrils. Want to make sure I get the size just right. And I also want to adjust my little highlights wherever they're needed. I want to make sure they're just right and that the nose shape is just right. And I'm painting tiny little black marks extending past the nose, and the reason for that, it's not dark hairs, it's the skin underneath that is darker, and so I'm going to have tiny little white hairs overlapping those areas after. Now we're going to start detailing our tongue a little bit by adding highlights. We're taking our same pink mixture as earlier and we're adding a little bit more white. And I don't want it a bright pink. I want it more of a corally color, more of a peachy color. So I added a little bit more burnt sienna. These little bits that I'm just painting in right now, that's her tongue, the way it's resting on the back of her teeth. So I'm just suggesting that. You can't really see it when you look inside the mouth because it is more shadowed, but I'm just going to suggest it. For this darker paint that I'm adding right now, I took some alizarin crimson and I added it to my pink mixture, as well as just a little hint of blue and just a tiny little smidgen of black, just a pinprick, just to darken it up so I can have more of a realistic shade of red on her tongue. I don't want it too pink, I don't want it too red, I don't want the shadows to be black all the way down, then you'll have that harsh separation between light and dark. So I just wanted to have a nice gradual transition between the darkest dark at the back of her tongue, moving up to the lighter areas in the front of her tongue. And I'm just blending all that in together. I'm going to start adding bits of light. I just want to gently go over the tongue with my lighter pink and kind of have it blend into the shadowed area as I go up there. And this is why I'm taking the dry brush and just softly blending that in. This way I get a nice gradual transition. You've got the whole range of values there from your darkest dark up on top going down to the lighter color. And I want to make sure I get definition between my teeth as well. So I'm just, again, correcting the shape now that the paint's completely dry and I'm not just going to be creating gray mud into my black lip. And I'm also outlining her tongue. That little darker edge under her tongue might seem insignificant, but it's just another one of those tiny little things that will add depth and realism to your painting. It's often tiny little details such as this one that just lend a whole aspect of realism to a painting. People will often look at a painting and wonder how you can make it look so realistic. Well, this is how. Is those tiny little details. Pay attention to those. Don't neglect them. Don't cut corners. Don't skimp. I'm just darkening up my shadow in the rear again. Just making sure I have my value range just right. I'm going to blend that in again with the brush, a dry brush. Just gently tapping on it. And now I'm coming in with my pink mixture again, and I lighten it up with even more white. And I'm just going to very gently go over the very edge of the tongue. And just by doing this, you can see how the tongue is starting to look wet now. So it's just little bits of highlights on the edge of her tongue. And again, it's another one of those little tiny details that might seem insignificant, but they just make the whole piece look a lot more realistic. And I'm going to blend in some more of those highlights. So now let's say when I painted her tongue, I had only used two colors. Can you imagine how flat it would look? There would be no range of values. You wouldn't have those dark darks. You wouldn't have the lighter lights. You would look at the whole tongue and it would just look like a crude pink shape. So I'm just adjusting the shape of her teeth here. I want to make sure I get it just right. And I'm also painting in a very pale gray to show shadows on her tooth, and this will help to emphasize the shape. It's a little bit hard to see on the recording, but I'm using a very pale gray mixture over the teeth. There are shadows, so you want to make sure you get those down. You don't want just a pure white tooth or pure white teeth. Those again will not look natural. The teeth are such tiny little areas, so you just want to make sure you go slow and be very careful. It's very easy to mess up the whole mouth by not getting the shape of the teeth right, or by having them too long or not long enough. One little paintbrush mark can throw the whole shape off. So keep that in mind, and that's true for any tiny little part that you might be working on, like an eye or anything else. If it's really small, it's very easy to mess up the shape. So just take your time and don't rush it. And now I'm just going to add a final layer of white hairs on her muzzle. And I'm just going in with pure white here. It's a little bit hard to see the definition in between all the white hairs, but you can see it in person. It's just, again, the camera is making the white so bright. But you can see some definition, and that's what you want. And around the nose, just tiny little nicks. The hairs are really short and tiny around the nose, so you want to make sure you don't have long strokes. keep working that all the way down. I don't want the pure white all the way down though, because I want some of that curve where her muzzle is, or her lip is turning inwards toward her mouth. And if I had pure white going all the way down, then I would not get that roundness. I am painting in some bright white hairs here, but I'm not making it full white all the way down. Detailing some of those little hairs. Gentle pressure again, otherwise your lines will be too thick. See, just like that. There was too much pressure there. And just a few scattered hairs under her nose too. Sometimes if you've messed up the shape of your nose, you can go back in later on, and just by painting in tiny little hairs around it, you can very easily adjust the shape of your nose. And I'm using that white on my chin also, just detailing some fine little hairs around her chin. With those little bits of whiteness on her chin like that, when I was looking at her painting in person, it kind of looked satiny, like satin shining in the sun. And I've started applying white paint around her throat area. And I'm just using a filbert brush on the side and applying white paint, and I'm using curling motions, trying to mimic the curls in her hair. And the darker layer of paint underneath the chin helps to lend definition to the whiter hairs. And directly under her chin here, I have a little bit more blue in my white mixture. I don't want a pure white. I just want delicate color, just hinting at hair. Whites can be a little bit difficult to work with, so just try not to go in too dark with your underpainting, but you don't want to go in too light either, because if you go in too light, you're not going to have definition. I'm kind of using my filbert brush just on the side. Using it on the side allows me to paint finer lines when I'm not messing up and have to wipe off like I just did. But a good filbert brush will stay nice and flat and thin on the side, and it helps you make hairs in larger areas. So it's a great brush to use, especially in larger areas where you have a lot of fur to lay down. You don't want to go in right away with a small brush. You want to lay down larger areas with larger brushes. And then you can refine and detail using a smaller brush. So I'm just going to keep going over the area, just adding more fur. And I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. And just getting down those last bits of fur on her neck, throat, her throat. And now I can come in with a smaller brush and just start detailing those finer hairs. And again, I am just using my Kanwasa brush, my 00 Sable Mix script brush. Just painting in random little hairs, just getting those final bits of detail. I'm just getting pure white on the very tips. I'm not applying it everywhere. I'm going to soften with this brush too. And I've speeded it up just a little bit as I paint the final hairs on the side of her face. Just using the same techniques we used before. Just getting in those last bits of detail. I lost a little bit of footage here where I painted in the black whiskers, but basically to paint the whiskers, I just make sure that my mixture has enough liquid fine detail as well as linseed oil. And I'm just going to use very gentle pressure and just have wide sweeping motions. It's always scary to paint in whiskers, very scary. I prefer waiting until everything is dry. This way, if I do mess up, I can wipe it off. If it's wet and I try and wipe it off, then I'm just going to erase everything that I painted underneath. So wait till your painting is dry, then paint in the whiskers. It's a little bit less intimidating this way. They're very tricky. If you don't have the right brush, see, I had a mark that was too thick there, so I was able to wipe it because it's dry underneath. If your brush is too thick, it's not going to work, and you want just the right size brush. I like using a liner brush. And here, that's how you can clean up a messed up whisker. And you can use a little bit of turpentine on just a bit of paper towel or on a clean brush too, just to clean up. And now I'm just going to go over it again. So don't be discouraged if you mess up your whiskers. They're very difficult. They take practice. Once you get really good, you can go fast. But truth be told, I've been painting since I'm 15 years old, and I still don't like going fast with my whiskers. I'd rather go slow and just try and get them just right. You want to make sure you get little curving motions as well. If you have to flip your canvas on the side or upside down, whichever way will make it easier for you to paint in those little whiskers, do that. You want your arm to be comfortable, and you want to be able to have a wide sweeping motion. Here's China's final portrait. See how much intense and vibrant those colors are compared to the recording. The video recording just throws so much light onto a canvas, and taking into consideration the canvas is wet as well, so that also creates more glare. So once it's dry, you take a good photo and the colors just come out and they're so rich. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration. I can appreciate it was a little bit long, but oil paintings do take a very long time. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, write them in the comments below. Somebody else might have the exact same questions, or they might benefit from your questions. And if you need any help, if you're going to attempt to paint this, or if you're painting anything else, just let me know and I'll try to help you as best as I can. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching and take care.